The scream tore through the frozen Virginia darkness at precisely 3 o'clock in the morning on February 14, 1853, a sound so raw and primal that it seemed to crack the very air itself. It echoed across the frost-covered fields of Blackridge Plantation, 20 miles south of Richmond, where the tobacco grew in summer and where human suffering bloomed in every season. The scream came from the carriage house, that squat timber building that sat behind the main house like a guilty secret, and it carried within it every imaginable shade of agony, terror, and the desperate realization that no amount of begging would stop what was happening inside those walls. The sound rose and fell, punctuated by the meaty thud of something heavy striking flesh, and then it cut off with a horrible abruptness that was somehow worse than the screaming itself. Elijah Morse heard it from his narrow bed in the slave quarters attached to the main house, where he slept apart from the field hands in his capacity as personal valet to the overseer. He lay perfectly still beneath his thin wool blanket, his dark eyes open and fixed on the whitewashed ceiling, his breathing controlled and even despite the hammering of his heart. At 32 years old, Elijah had learned the crucial art of stillness, of making himself invisible even when fully visible, of existing in the spaces between notice and memory. His body did not flinch at the scream because flinching implied the luxury of surprise, and surprise was an emotion that had been beaten out of enslaved people at Blackridge long ago. Instead, something else flickered behind those steady eyes, something cold and patient and calculating, like ice forming slowly across a winter pond. The plantation had been named for the family that owned it, the Blackridges, who had claimed this particular stretch of Virginia soil for 3 generations. The current master, Silas Blackridge, was a thin-lipped man of 48 with the pale, indoor complexion of someone who spent more time in Richmond's gentlemen's clubs than on his own land. He had inherited 240 acres of prime tobacco fields, a manor house of modest Georgian design, and 43 enslaved human beings whose names he could barely remember and whose faces he rarely bothered to distinguish one from another. Silas preferred the abstractions of ledgers and profit margins to the messy reality of the labor that generated his wealth, and so he spent most of his time in the city, attending to business and politics and leaving the daily operations of Blackridge to his overseer. That overseer was Bartholomew Crenshaw, and he was the true master of Blackridge Plantation in every way that mattered. Crenshaw had come down from Pennsylvania 7 years prior, a younger son of a failed merchant family who had discovered that his particular talents were unsuited to honest trade but perfectly calibrated for the extraction of labor through fear. He was a compact man, barrel-chested and strong, with pale blue eyes that seemed to have no bottom to them, like windows into an empty room. His face was perpetually ruddy, whether from whiskey or rage or both, and he wore his authority like a second skin, that unthinking confidence of a man who had never encountered meaningful consequences for his actions. At 36, Crenshaw had found his calling in the absolute power over other human beings, and he exercised that power with the creativity of someone who had finally discovered his life's purpose. Elijah had been at Blackridge for 3 years, sold south from a smaller estate in Maryland after his previous owner had died and the property was divided among quarreling heirs. Before that sale, before Blackridge, before Crenshaw, Elijah's life had contained certain small mercies that seemed like impossible luxuries in retrospect. His previous owner's daughter, Miss Catherine, had been a peculiar young woman with abolitionist sympathies she could only express in secret, and she had taught Elijah to read using discarded books and Sunday afternoons when her father was occupied elsewhere. She had taught him letters first, then words, then whole passages of history and philosophy, opening a door in his mind that could never be closed again. Reading had given Elijah a dangerous gift, the ability to understand the precise mechanics of his own oppression, to see the system entire rather than merely experience its daily cruelties. When he was sold to Blackridge, he had been careful to hide this literacy, understanding instinctively that knowledge was dangerous for an enslaved person, that it marked you as unpredictable and therefore threatening. His education meant that Elijah could read the Virginia newspapers that Crenshaw left scattered in his office, could understand the legal frameworks that treated him as property worth $800 on a bill of sale, could comprehend the economic arguments about soil depletion and crop rotation that determined whether families would be kept together or torn apart. This knowledge sat in his mind like a stone in his stomach, heavy and indigestible, a constant reminder of the vast machinery of injustice in which he was merely a single expendable cog. But Elijah had learned to compartmentalize, to perform the role expected of him while maintaining a core of self that remained untouched and observant, cataloging everything, forgetting nothing. His duties as Crenshaw's valet were designed to humiliate as much as to serve. Each morning at 5 o'clock, Elijah entered the overseer's private quarters in the main house, a suite of rooms that had once belonged to Silas Blackridge's deceased mother and which Crenshaw had claimed as his own domain. He would find Crenshaw still abed, usually reeking of whiskey from the night before, and would be required to help the man dress as if he were an invalid rather than a grown man perfectly capable of pulling on his own trousers. Elijah would button Crenshaw's shirts with steady fingers, tie his cravat, brush his coat, and all the while Crenshaw would speak to him as one might speak to a dog, a constant stream of casual cruelty disguised as conversation. The boot-shining ritual was particularly degrading. Each evening, Elijah would kneel at Crenshaw's feet to remove his boots, often still flecked with the mud and filth of the fields or stables, sometimes with darker stains that Elijah tried not to think about. He would carry them to his small workroom off the kitchen and spend an hour working saddle soap and polish into the leather, buffing them to a mirror shine, knowing that by the next evening they would be filthy again and the entire performance would repeat. It was make work, a demonstration of power, a daily reminder that Elijah's time and effort were worth less than the shine on a boot. The whiskey service was another nightly ritual. Crenshaw preferred Kentucky bourbon, which arrived in wooden crates shipped up from New Orleans, and he consumed it with the dedicated focus of a man trying to drown something that refused to stay underwater. At precisely 8 o'clock each evening, Elijah would appear in the overseer's office with a crystal decanter and a single glass on a silver tray, items that had belonged to the Blackridge family for generations and which seemed obscene in Crenshaw's possession. He would pour exactly 2 fingers of amber liquid, set the glass on the desk at Crenshaw's right hand, and stand silently while Crenshaw pretended to ignore him for exactly 1 minute, a petty power play that never varied. Only then would Crenshaw wave him away with a flick of his fingers, not even looking up from whatever papers or ledgers he was reviewing. The plantation hierarchy at Blackridge was brutally simple and absolute. Silas Blackridge was the owner, the distant god who appeared perhaps once a month to review accounts and collect his profits before retreating to Richmond's comforts. Beneath him was Crenshaw, who wielded total authority in Silas's absence, which was to say almost always. Crenshaw commanded 2 assistant overseers, rough men named Hayes and Donovan who were essentially enforcers, and between them they controlled every aspect of plantation life. The enslaved population was divided into house servants, field hands, craftsmen, and the children who were being trained for future labor, each group with its own internal hierarchies of age and favor and perceived value. Elijah occupied a strange position in this structure, neither fully of the house nor of the fields. As Crenshaw's personal valet, he had access to spaces and information denied to others, but this proximity to power also made him an object of suspicion and resentment among some of the other enslaved people. They saw him entering the main house freely, wearing better clothes than field hands were permitted, eating scraps from the master's table, and some assumed he had become complicit in their oppression. They could not see what Elijah saw every day, the casual brutality, the ledgers detailing human suffering, the plans for punishments yet to be inflicted. They could not know that his position was not privilege but a different form of torture, an intimate familiarity with the machinery of their collective destruction. February in Virginia carried a damp cold that sank into bones and joints, making the fields treacherous with frost and the mornings an ordeal of numb fingers and aching limbs. The enslaved people of Blackridge still worked those fields regardless of weather, the cotton having been harvested but the land requiring preparation for spring tobacco planting. They worked from sunup to sundown, their breath making clouds in the frigid air, their thin clothes inadequate against the cold because Crenshaw believed that comfort made workers lazy. He had theories about labor efficiency, about the proper application of privation and fear, and he tested these theories on human bodies with the detachment of a natural philosopher conducting experiments. Crenshaw's office was located in what had been the plantation's library, though most of the books had been sold off or allowed to molder. Now the room contained a massive oak desk, filing cabinets for record-keeping, and a gun case displaying the overseer's collection of rifles and pistols. One wall was dominated by a detailed map of Blackridge's acreage, with the fields numbered and annotated in Crenshaw's precise handwriting. Another wall featured a large slate board where he tracked daily productivity, listing each enslaved person by name and the amount of work completed, with shortfalls marked in red chalk. This board was both an accounting tool and threat, a public display of who was falling behind and therefore subject to correction. The correction came in many forms, but Crenshaw's favorite was the whip, a braided leather instrument he kept hung on a hook behind his desk where everyone who entered his office could see it. The whip was not merely functional but symbolic, a constant reminder of the violence that underpinned every aspect of plantation life. Crenshaw did not believe in what he called excessive correction, not out of mercy but because he understood that damaged workers were less productive. He had calculated the optimal number of lashes to motivate without incapacitating, the precise amount of pain required to instill fear without causing lasting injury that would affect labor output. This calculation was itself a horror, the reduction of human suffering to a mathematical formula. That night, the night of the scream, Elijah had been lying awake because sleep came hard at Blackridge. The cold was part of it, but mostly it was the constant low-level vigilance required to survive, the inability to ever fully relax because danger could materialize at any moment. He had been thinking about his sister, Sarah, who worked in the main house kitchen, the only family he had left after their mother had died of fever 2 winters past and their father had been sold away when Elijah was just a boy. Sarah was 19, quick-witted and careful, and Elijah devoted considerable energy to keeping her out of Crenshaw's direct attention, understanding that young women at Blackridge faced particular dangers that went beyond the whip. When the scream came, Elijah knew immediately what it was and where it originated. The carriage house was where Crenshaw conducted his private corrections, away from the main house where Silas might theoretically hear if he were ever present, though everyone understood that Silas heard exactly what he chose to hear and nothing more. The scream belonged to Marcus, a field hand of about 25 who had made the fatal error of talking back to Assistant Overseer Hayes during the afternoon's work detail. Marcus had a wife, Delilah, and a baby daughter born just that past November, and he had been pushing his luck lately with small acts of defiance, the kind of resistance that built up in a man until it overflowed despite all wisdom and self-preservation. Elijah rose from his bed and moved to the small window that looked out toward the carriage house. He could see the glow of a lantern through the building's single high window, could see shadows moving inside, could imagine with terrible clarity what was happening in that space. He stood there for perhaps 10 minutes, watching and listening, his face an expressionless mask but his hands clenched into fists at his sides. When the lantern light finally dimmed and the carriage house door opened, Crenshaw emerged, rolling down his shirt sleeves and calling for Hayes to clean up the mess inside. 2 other enslaved men were summoned to carry Marcus out, his body limp between them, and even from this distance Elijah could see the dark stains on his back where the whip had torn through cloth and skin. Something shifted in Elijah in that moment, something fundamental and irreversible. It was not sudden outrage, because outrage was a luxury he could not afford and would not have survived. It was colder than that, more deliberate, a kind of internal door closing on one version of himself while another version, patient and calculating and utterly without mercy, began to wake up. He watched Crenshaw walk back toward the main house, the overseer's gait steady and unconcerned, a man who had simply completed another evening task and was ready for his whiskey. Elijah made no decision in that moment because the decision had already been made by 3 years of accumulated humiliations, by his sister's fear, by Marcus's screams, by the fundamental impossibility of human dignity under the boot of absolute power. He returned to his bed and lay down, pulling the thin blanket up to his chin, and stared at the ceiling until dawn began to gray the window. His breathing remained steady and even. His face showed nothing. But behind his eyes, in the privacy of his own mind, Elijah Morse began to plan. If you're fascinated by the darkest corners of American history, subscribe now and drop a comment telling me which historical horror story I should cover next. Marcus survived the beating, though survival at Blackridge was a relative term that measured only the continuation of breath and heartbeat, not anything resembling human flourishing. He returned to the fields 3 days later, moving with the careful stiffness of a man whose back was still healing beneath his shirt, the wounds scabbing over in patterns that would become permanent scars. Delilah, his wife, had tended those wounds with what meager supplies she could gather, salt water and clean rags stolen from the main house laundry, her hands gentle on ruined flesh while their infant daughter slept in a wooden box that served as a cradle. Marcus did not speak of what happened in the carriage house, and no one asked, because there was nothing to say that everyone did not already know. Elijah watched this recovery with the same careful attention he paid to everything at Blackridge, cataloging details and filing them away in the ordered spaces of his mind. He noticed how Marcus flinched when anyone approached from behind, how his eyes had acquired a new wariness that bordered on the feral, how something essential had been extracted from him during those hours with Crenshaw. This extraction was intentional, part of a system refined over generations to break human beings down into compliant labor units, and Crenshaw had mastered the technique with the pride of an artisan perfecting his craft. The overseer kept a journal, a thick leather-bound ledger that he maintained with meticulous care in his office desk's locked drawer. Elijah had discovered this journal 2 months after arriving at Blackridge, during one of his evening duties when Crenshaw had stepped away briefly and left his keys on the desk. Curiosity and his forbidden literacy had compelled Elijah to open that drawer, and what he found inside had confirmed his worst suspicions about the nature of the man he served. The journal was not merely an accounting of plantation business but a detailed record of punishments administered, methodically documented with dates, names, alleged infractions, and the specific corrections applied. Crenshaw wrote in a small, precise hand that suggested a man who took pride in his thoroughness, describing each punishment with clinical detachment and occasionally adding observations about effectiveness and future modifications. Elijah began reading this journal whenever opportunity allowed, memorizing passages that burned themselves into his consciousness like brands. There was an entry from November 1851 describing the whipping of a woman named Ruth for the crime of nursing her sick child when she should have been working in the main house. 10 lashes that Crenshaw noted were administered with restraint to preserve her ability to resume duties the following day. There was an entry from March 1852 detailing the sale of a family, parents and 3 children, to a trader heading to the Deep South cotton plantations, a transaction Crenshaw had arranged personally and from which he had collected a finder's fee that he recorded without shame. There was an entry from July 1852 describing an experimental reduction in food rations to determine the minimum caloric intake necessary to maintain work output, a 6-week trial that had resulted in 2 deaths among the elderly enslaved population, which Crenshaw noted as acceptable losses given their diminished productivity. The journal revealed that Crenshaw's cruelty was not impulsive but systematic, governed by a twisted logic that sought to optimize suffering for maximum control. He had theories about the psychology of enslaved people, about the breaking points of human will, about the precise calibration of hope and despair necessary to prevent both rebellion and complete collapse into uselessness. He tested these theories on human subjects with the dispassion of a natural philosopher, recording results and adjusting variables, building a personal science of oppression that he clearly believed demonstrated his superiority and sophistication. Every Sunday, Crenshaw required all enslaved people who were not bedridden to attend a prayer service in the clearing behind the main house. This service was mandatory, and absence resulted in immediate punishment. A traveling preacher, Reverend Talbot, would arrive from Richmond to deliver sermons carefully selected to reinforce the existing order, biblical passages about servants obeying their masters, about the curse of Ham, about suffering in this world preparing souls for reward in the next. The Reverend was a thin man with a weak chin who spoke in tremulous tones about divine will and the natural order of things, his words a theological justification for atrocity. After the sermon concluded, if anyone had committed infractions during the previous week, Crenshaw would administer public whippings right there in the clearing while the assembled enslaved population was forced to watch, a weekly demonstration that combined religious authority with physical terror in a performance designed to break both body and spirit. Elijah stood through these Sunday rituals with his face carefully blank, his mind dissociating from the immediate reality to preserve his sanity. He had learned this technique as a child, this ability to separate his consciousness from his circumstances, to retreat into the fortress of his own thoughts while his body remained present and obedient. But lately this dissociation was becoming harder to maintain, the fortress walls showing cracks, the carefully controlled rage beginning to seep through despite all his discipline. The slaves' quarters at Blackridge were arranged in 2 long rows of timber cabins with dirt floors and no windows, structures barely adequate to keep out rain and utterly inadequate against Virginia winters. Each cabin housed between 6 and 10 people depending on family size, with sleeping arrangements on rough wooden platforms and privacy an impossible luxury. The cabins were intentionally cramped and uncomfortable, part of Crenshaw's belief that any degree of comfort would diminish motivation to work. Elijah's own quarters attached to the main house were only marginally better, a narrow room with a proper floor and a single shuttered window, but even this small improvement separated him from the community and marked him as different, potentially complicit, certainly under suspicion. Food at Blackridge was distributed weekly, measured rations of cornmeal, salt pork, and molasses that were calculated to provide subsistence nutrition and nothing more. Crenshaw had studied the minimum requirements to keep laborers functional, and he provided exactly that minimum, seeing no reason to waste resources on anything beyond bare survival. The elderly and very young received reduced portions based on their reduced labor capacity, a policy that resulted in chronic malnutrition among the most vulnerable. Elijah, as house servant, had access to kitchen scraps and occasionally better food, but he shared what he could with Sarah and a few others, a small act of resistance that provided minimal relief against systemic starvation. Winter was particularly brutal at Blackridge because clothing distribution was inadequate and infrequent. Most enslaved people had only 2 sets of clothes, one for summer and one for winter, with the winter garments being only slightly heavier than their summer counterparts. Shoes were distributed in November, rough brogans that rarely fit properly and wore out long before the next distribution. Frostbite was common during the coldest months, particularly among field hands whose work kept them outdoors regardless of temperature. Crenshaw considered requests for additional clothing or better shoes to be evidence of malingering, and such requests often resulted in punishment rather than relief. The breaking point that would ultimately seal Crenshaw's fate came on a bitter morning in late February, nearly 2 weeks after Marcus's beating. Elijah had entered the overseer's office to deliver the morning's post, which had arrived from Richmond by courier. Sarah was there as well, having been summoned to clean the fireplace, a task that required her to kneel before the hearth with her back to the room. Crenshaw was reviewing correspondence at his desk, and Elijah performed his usual routine of setting the post on the corner of the desk before retreating to his station by the door, ready to be summoned if needed. What happened next occurred with the casual suddenness of a predator striking. Crenshaw rose from his desk, walked over to where Sarah knelt working, and placed his hand on her shoulder. She froze immediately, understanding the terrible significance of that touch, and Elijah felt his own body go rigid with a fear and rage so intense it nearly overwhelmed his ability to remain still. Crenshaw spoke in a conversational tone, remarking on Sarah's youth and comeliness, his hand moving from her shoulder to her hair, his intentions absolutely clear. Sarah did not look up, did not speak, her entire being contracted into terrified submission because resistance would only make what was about to happen worse. Crenshaw ordered Elijah to stand guard outside the office door and ensure they were not disturbed. The command was delivered in that same conversational tone, as if he were requesting that Elijah fetch his boots rather than ordering him to facilitate the assault of his own sister. Elijah's mind seemed to split in that moment, one part maintaining the expressionless mask and obedient posture while another part retreated into a white-hot core of absolute fury. He walked to the door, opened it, stepped through, and pulled it closed behind him with steady hands that showed no tremor despite the fact that his entire world had just collapsed into a singularity of hatred. He stood in the hallway outside that door for 23 minutes. He counted every second, his mind clinging to the numbers as an anchor against the sounds that came through the door, muffled but unmistakable. Sarah made almost no noise, understanding that crying out would achieve nothing except to alert others to her degradation, her silence more devastating than screams would have been. When Crenshaw finally opened the door and dismissed them both with a wave, Sarah emerged with her face blank and her movements mechanical, a living person who had temporarily vacated her own body as a mercy. She walked past Elijah without meeting his eyes, and he let her go, knowing that any gesture of comfort or acknowledgement would only deepen her shame. That night, Elijah lay on his narrow bed and stared at the ceiling for hours. He did not cry because tears were useless. He did not rage because rage without direction was merely noise. Instead, he felt something settle into place inside him, a cold certainty that calcified around his heart like ice forming on still water. The man who had been Elijah Morse, who had preserved some core of humanity through 3 years of degradation, began to transform into something else entirely. He began to transform into an instrument of vengeance, precise and patient and utterly without mercy. He began to plan in earnest that very night, lying in the darkness and thinking through possibilities with the methodical attention to detail that his literacy and intelligence enabled. He considered and rejected quick violence, understanding that a moment's satisfaction would result in his immediate execution and change nothing about the system that enabled Crenshaw's atrocities. He considered escape, but escape would mean leaving Sarah and the others behind, and besides, where would he run that the law would not consider him stolen property to be returned? He considered poison, but poison was unreliable and might kill too quickly, denying Crenshaw the understanding of why he was dying. No, what Elijah began to conceive in those dark hours was something far more terrible and far more appropriate. He would make Crenshaw suffer. He would make the suffering last. He would ensure that before death came, Crenshaw would understand completely what he had done and who was repaying him for those crimes. It would require planning, patience, and an absolute commitment to seeing it through regardless of the cost to his own soul. Elijah discovered that he was willing to pay that cost, that he had in fact already paid it the moment he stood guard outside that office door. The next morning, he rose before dawn and performed his usual duties with mechanical precision. He brought Crenshaw his shaving water, helped him dress, served his breakfast, all without a flicker of emotion or hesitation. Crenshaw noticed nothing unusual because he had never truly looked at Elijah as a person capable of inner life or independent thought. This invisibility, which had once been a source of degradation, now became a weapon. Elijah could plan his revenge in plain sight because monsters like Crenshaw could not imagine that their victims were capable of such calculation. But what you don't know yet is how he'd make the overseer beg for death long before it came. Before we continue, hit that subscribe button and comment below what you think drove him to this point. Stay with me. The transformation of Elijah Morse from victim to architect of retribution did not happen in a single dramatic moment but rather unfolded across 6 weeks of meticulous observation and glacially patient preparation. He became a student of Bartholomew Crenshaw's existence, noting every pattern and habit with the intense focus of a hunter learning the movements of dangerous prey. Elijah had always been observant by necessity, survival at Blackridge requiring constant awareness of the overseer's moods and movements, but now his observation acquired a different quality, purposeful and predatory, gathering intelligence that would later be weaponized. Crenshaw was a creature of rigid habits, his days following patterns so predictable they could be charted like the movements of celestial bodies. He rose each morning at 6, demanded his shaving water be precisely heated to a temperature he could test with his finger, and required Elijah's assistance with dressing despite being perfectly capable of managing his own buttons and laces. Breakfast was taken at 7 in the small dining room off the main kitchen, always the same meal of eggs, ham, biscuits, and coffee strong enough to strip paint. By 8 he would be in his office reviewing the previous day's work reports from his assistant overseers, marking shortfalls on his slate board in red chalk, determining who would require correction. But it was Thursday evenings that interested Elijah most intensely. Every Thursday without exception, after reviewing the week's cotton gin output and tobacco preparation, Crenshaw would settle into his office chair with his ledgers and his bottle of Kentucky bourbon and proceed to drink himself into a state of controlled inebriation. He never became sloppy drunk, his tolerance too well developed for that, but by 9 o'clock his reactions would be slower, his judgment impaired, his guard lowered. On these Thursday nights, Crenshaw would dismiss Elijah earlier than usual, wanting privacy for whatever dark thoughts occupied him during these solitary drinking sessions. This weekly ritual represented a vulnerability, a crack in the armor of constant vigilance, and Elijah recognized it as the foundation upon which his plan could be built. The stealing began in early March, small items taken from locations scattered across the plantation so that no single theft would raise alarm or even be noticed. From the tack room behind the stables, Elijah took 2 lengths of leather strap, the kind used for securing saddles, strong enough to bear significant weight and flexible enough to bind without breaking. He took them on separate occasions 3 days apart, hiding them beneath his coat and spiriting them to his quarters where he concealed them under the loose floorboard beneath his bed. From the butchering shed where hogs were slaughtered each autumn, he took a skinning knife, a vicious curved blade kept sharp enough to separate hide from flesh with surgical precision. The knife disappeared during the chaos of a March morning when a pig had escaped its pen and everyone's attention was focused on recapturing the animal before it could damage the kitchen garden. The laudanum presented a greater challenge because it was kept in the locked medical cabinet in the plantation doctor's office, a small building near the slave quarters where Dr. Whitmore maintained his supplies and occasionally treated injuries too severe to be ignored. Dr. Whitmore was an elderly man from Richmond who visited Blackridge twice monthly, more out of financial necessity than humanitarian concern, and he was careless with his keys in the way that old men often become careless with familiar routines. Elijah observed him during a March visit, noted that he hung his key ring on a hook by the door while he worked, and created a distraction by deliberately dropping a tray of medical instruments just as the doctor was preparing to leave. In the confusion of helping to gather scattered scalpels and forceps, Elijah's fingers found the laudanum bottle and transferred it to his pocket in a movement so smooth it might never have happened at all. Rope came from the tobacco barn, 50 feet of good hemp line used for hanging tobacco leaves during the curing process. Elijah took it in 10-foot sections over the course of a week, cutting lengths from the massive coils stored in the barn's back corner where inventory was rarely checked with precision. He chose sections from different coils so that no single rope would show obvious signs of theft, and he hid each length in a different location, one under the woodpile behind the kitchen, another in the hollow of an old oak tree at the edge of the property, another buried in a cloth sack beneath the floor of the abandoned smokehouse that had not been used since a fire damaged it 2 years prior. The location for what Elijah was planning revealed itself during a routine errand in mid-March. Crenshaw had sent him to inventory the outbuildings on the far eastern edge of Blackridge property, structures left over from previous generations that had fallen into disuse as the plantation's focus shifted. Among these abandoned buildings was an old ice house, a semi-subterranean structure built 40 years earlier by Silas Blackridge's grandfather, designed with thick stone walls and a deep pit to store winter ice packed in sawdust for use during summer months. The practice had been abandoned when a newer ice house was built closer to the main house, and this original structure had been forgotten, its door hanging crooked on rusted hinges, its interior dark and cold and perfectly isolated. Elijah descended the short flight of stone steps into the ice house and stood in the darkness, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. The structure was perhaps 15 feet square, with walls of fitted stone 3 feet thick that had been built to preserve cold but which would serve equally well to contain sound. The ceiling was low, maybe 7 feet at its highest point, supported by heavy timber beams. The floor was packed earth, undisturbed for years, and the air smelled of mineral dampness and ancient cold. A person could scream themselves hoarse in this space and no sound would carry beyond those massive walls. Elijah stood there for several minutes, his breathing steady and his mind calculating distances and angles and possibilities. This was the place. This forgotten tomb would become the theater for Crenshaw's final performance. Over the following weeks, Elijah made several trips to the ice house, always finding legitimate reasons to be in that area of the property, never visiting the structure more than once every few days to avoid establishing a suspicious pattern. He brought a wooden chair salvaged from a trash pile, sturdy enough to bear weight. He brought an old butcher's table, heavy oak scarred with decades of knife marks, and positioned it carefully in the center of the space. He brought oil lamps and a tin of lamp oil, candles and matches wrapped in oiled cloth to stay dry. Each item was carried separately and concealed immediately, building his arsenal piece by methodical piece. But physical preparation was only part of what Elijah required. He needed knowledge, specific understanding of human anatomy that would allow him to inflict maximum suffering while maintaining consciousness and life for as long as possible. He began by observing the plantation's butchering operations with new intensity, watching how the butcher separated pig skin from the underlying tissue, noting the technique of the blade, the angle of cuts, the layering of hide and fat and muscle. He volunteered to assist with these operations, an offer that was accepted without question because manual labor from anyone was valued at Blackridge. During one of his evening duties, while Crenshaw was occupied elsewhere, Elijah discovered a medical text in the overseer's office, a volume titled Gray's Anatomy with detailed illustrations of human musculature and the body's various systems. Crenshaw had apparently acquired it as part of his self-education in the mechanics of punishment, wanting to understand where he could strike without causing permanent disability that would reduce a worker's value. Elijah began stealing time with this book, memorizing its illustrations during the few minutes he might have alone in the office, understanding the architecture of the human body with the attention of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. He learned where the major blood vessels ran, understanding that severing them would cause rapid death through exsanguination, which was to be avoided until the final moments. He learned about the nervous system, about pain receptors and the body's thresholds for shock. He learned that the human body could survive remarkable trauma if vital organs were protected, that consciousness could be maintained through agony that would seem unsurvivable. This knowledge accumulated in his mind like water filling a cistern, cold and patient and ready to be poured out when the time came. Elijah's psychological state during these weeks of preparation was remarkable for its absolute clarity and absence of doubt. He experienced no moral hesitation, no crisis of conscience, no fear of divine punishment or earthly consequences. The man he had been before, the man who had retained some belief in justice or redemption, had died in the hallway outside Crenshaw's office while Sarah suffered behind that closed door. What remained was something simpler and more terrible, a mechanism of vengeance that operated with the pure function of a well-made machine. He did not speak to Sarah about what was growing in his mind, understanding that knowledge of his plans would only burden her with complicity and danger. She had withdrawn into herself since the assault, performing her duties with mechanical efficiency while something vital seemed to have been extracted from her spirit. This diminishment of his sister fed Elijah's resolve, a constant reminder that what he was planning was not merely personal revenge but a restoration of balance, a correction of accounts that had been too long outstanding. By the third week of March, all the physical elements were in place. The ice house was prepared, the tools were gathered, the escape routes were memorized, and the schedule was understood. Elijah had even prepared explanations for his whereabouts should anyone ask, though he suspected no one would because enslaved people's movements were only tracked when they were needed for labor, not when they were presumably sleeping in their quarters. The final element was timing, waiting for the right Thursday when circumstances would align, when Silas Blackridge would be away in Richmond as he usually was, when the assistant overseers would be occupied with their own concerns, when the night would be dark enough to move unseen. That Thursday came on March 21st, the spring equinox, when day and night stood in brief balance before the light began its inevitable expansion toward summer. It seemed appropriate somehow, this liminal moment between seasons, this threshold between one version of the world and another. Elijah woke that morning with absolute calm, dressed for his duties, and began the day that would end with Bartholomew Crenshaw bound and helpless in an abandoned ice house, about to understand what it meant to be completely powerless in the hands of someone who had stopped believing in mercy. If this story is giving you chills, make sure you're subscribed and let me know in the comments if you've heard of the Blackridge revenge before. The day of March 21, 1853, began like any other at Blackridge Plantation, with no celestial portent or atmospheric disturbance to mark it as the day Bartholomew Crenshaw's world would end. The morning dawned cold and clear, frost still clinging to the tobacco fields in crystalline patterns that would melt by mid-morning. Elijah rose at his usual hour, performed his usual ablutions, and entered Crenshaw's quarters with the shaving water heated to the precise temperature the overseer demanded. His hands were steady as he helped Crenshaw dress, his face showing nothing but the blank attentiveness that had become his permanent mask. Inside, behind that mask, his mind was reviewing the plan with the methodical precision of a watchmaker examining the gears of a complex mechanism, checking each element, ensuring nothing had been overlooked. Crenshaw was in an expansive mood that morning, which is to say he was slightly less caustic than usual in his casual cruelties. He had received correspondence from Silas Blackridge confirming that the owner would remain in Richmond for another 2 weeks, occupied with legislative business that seemed always to keep him conveniently distant from the source of his wealth. This absence pleased Crenshaw because it meant continued autonomy, no interference in his operations, no uncomfortable questions about his methods. He spoke about this to Elijah while being dressed, not because he valued Elijah's opinion but because enslaved people made convenient receptacles for thoughts that required voicing, living journals who could be trusted never to repeat what they heard because no one would listen to them anyway. The day proceeded through its ordinary rhythms. Field hands worked the soil, preparing for spring planting. House servants cleaned and cooked and maintained the infrastructure of the main house. Assistant overseers Hayes and Donovan made their rounds, ensuring productivity remained at expected levels, administering minor corrections for minor infractions. Elijah performed his duties with mechanical efficiency, bringing Crenshaw his lunch, delivering messages, standing silent and available in the office while the overseer conducted the mundane business of running a plantation built on human suffering. To any observer, Elijah appeared exactly as he had appeared every day for 3 years, unremarkable and reliable, a well-trained servant whose inner life was assumed to be as simple and empty as his station implied. But as afternoon faded toward evening, Elijah began the final preparations for what was to come. At 4 o'clock, he excused himself briefly from the main house, ostensibly to retrieve firewood for Crenshaw's office hearth. Instead, he went to the abandoned smokehouse where he had hidden the laudanum bottle and transferred it to a leather pouch he wore under his shirt. The bottle was small, dark glass, containing perhaps 4 ounces of the tincture, enough to render a grown man sluggish and confused without causing unconsciousness. Dosage was critical, too much would make Crenshaw useless and impossible to move, too little would leave him too alert and dangerous. Elijah had calculated the proper amount through careful observation of Dr. Whitmore's prescriptions and through his own reading in the medical texts, arriving at what he believed was the precise measurement necessary. At 6 o'clock, Elijah served Crenshaw his supper in the small dining room, the usual evening meal of roasted chicken, potatoes, and bread. He poured Crenshaw's wine, a red imported from France that the overseer fancied himself a connoisseur of despite his pedestrian palate. At 8 o'clock, as Thursday custom dictated, Elijah appeared in the office with the crystal decanter of Kentucky bourbon and the single glass on the silver tray. This was the moment everything depended upon, and Elijah's hands remained perfectly steady as he poured exactly 2 fingers of amber liquid into the glass. The laudanum had already been added to the bourbon in the decanter, measured precisely and mixed thoroughly so that no sediment would settle or taste betray its presence. The bitter opium flavor would be masked by the whiskey's own burn, and Crenshaw's Thursday evening habit was to drink rapidly, seeking the numbing effect rather than savoring the taste. Elijah set the glass at Crenshaw's right hand and stepped back to his usual position, watching without appearing to watch as the overseer reached for the glass with the automatic gesture of ritual and raised it to his lips. Crenshaw drank half the glass in the first swallow, grimaced slightly at what might have been a sharper bite than usual, then finished the remainder. He set the glass down and waved Elijah away earlier than usual, wanting privacy for his evening's drinking and brooding. Elijah bowed slightly and withdrew, closing the office door behind him, and then retreated to his quarters to wait. The laudanum would take perhaps 30 minutes to manifest its full effects, beginning with a pleasant warmth and relaxation, progressing to mild confusion and impaired coordination, settling finally into a state of suggestible docility that would make Crenshaw manageable but still conscious and aware. Elijah used this waiting period to complete his final preparations. He changed from his house servant's clothing into darker garments more suitable for night work, rough wool trousers and a heavy shirt that he would not mind destroying. He retrieved the leather straps from beneath his floorboard, the rope from its hiding place, the skinning knife wrapped in cloth. He assembled these items with the calm efficiency of a craftsman gathering tools for a familiar job. At 9 o'clock, he left his quarters through the rear door and made his way across the dark grounds toward the old ice house, moving through shadows and keeping clear of the areas where assistant overseers might be patrolling. The ice house stood silent and waiting, its entrance a darker shadow against the darkness of the night. Elijah descended the stone steps and lit 2 oil lamps, their flames casting wavering light across the prepared space. The wooden chair waited in the center of the room. The butcher's table stood ready against one wall. The tools were arranged on a clean cloth, each implement positioned with surgical precision. Everything was ready. Now he needed only the main component of his design, and that component was currently sitting in his office, drugged and vulnerable, waiting to be collected. Creating the false emergency required careful theater. At 9:30, Elijah returned to the main house and approached the office with urgency in his posture and alarm carefully constructed on his face. He knocked rapidly on the door and called out that there was smoke rising from the distant tobacco barn, that it appeared a fire had started, that immediate attention was required. Crenshaw opened the door, his movements already slightly uncoordinated, his eyes showing the glassy quality of the laudanum beginning its work. The overseer's first instinct was anger at the interruption, but the mention of fire and the tobacco barn penetrated even his drugged state because fire represented potential financial catastrophe. Crenshaw grabbed his coat and demanded Elijah lead him to the site immediately, not bothering to wake Hayes or Donovan because he wanted to assess the situation himself before raising a general alarm that might prove embarrassing if the smoke turned out to be nothing. This pride and need for control played exactly as Elijah had calculated, and the two men set off across the dark plantation grounds, Elijah carrying a lantern and leading Crenshaw along the path that would take them past the old ice house. The overseer followed, stumbling occasionally on the uneven ground, his coordination worsening with each minute as the laudanum saturated his system. The tobacco barn was on the far eastern edge of the property, and the path Elijah chose was the longest route, maximizing the time for the drug to work and minimizing the chance of encountering anyone else. They walked through pools of lantern light alternating with stretches of profound darkness, Crenshaw breathing heavily and cursing the cold and demanding to know why Elijah was taking such a roundabout path. Elijah responded with deference, explaining that this route avoided the muddy sections still frozen from recent rain, maintaining the fiction of helpful service even as he led the overseer toward his doom. When they reached the old ice house, Elijah paused and pointed toward a section of trees beyond it, claiming he could see smoke rising against the stars. Crenshaw squinted in the direction indicated, his drugged mind struggling to focus, and in that moment of distraction Elijah moved with decisive speed. The leather strap came around Crenshaw's throat from behind, not to strangle but to control, pressure applied to the carotid arteries to reduce blood flow to the brain. Crenshaw struggled, his hands reaching back ineffectually, but the laudanum had robbed him of coordination and strength, and Elijah was driven by 3 years of accumulated rage given purpose and direction. The overseer's struggles weakened, his body going limp, and Elijah dragged him down the stone steps into the ice house. He worked quickly now, binding Crenshaw to the wooden chair with rope around chest and legs, securing his arms outstretched on the butcher's table with leather straps around each wrist. The position was cruciform, arms spread wide, and there was a bitter irony in this that Elijah noted but did not dwell upon. He worked with the efficiency of practice, though this was his first time, his preparation and visualization having been so thorough that the physical execution felt like repetition rather than novelty. Crenshaw began to regain consciousness perhaps 10 minutes later, his head rolling forward then snapping back as awareness returned. His eyes opened, unfocused at first, then sharpening with growing comprehension as he understood his situation. He was bound completely, unable to move anything but his head, in a cold dark space lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on stone walls. And standing before him, holding a curved skinning knife that caught the lamplight along its edge, was Elijah Morse, his face no longer showing the blank servility of a valet but instead displaying an expression of such cold purpose that it was more terrifying than rage would have been. Crenshaw's first response was predictable, outrage before fear, the instinct of a man accustomed to absolute authority. He demanded to be released immediately, threatened terrible punishments, and invoked Silas Blackridge's name as if it were a protective talisman. Elijah listened to these threats in silence, waiting for them to exhaust themselves, and when Crenshaw finally paused for breath, Elijah spoke for the first time in a voice that was calm and clear and absolutely without mercy. He told Crenshaw exactly what was about to happen and exactly why. Elijah's explanation was methodical and comprehensive, delivered in the educated diction that Crenshaw had always mocked as pretension in an enslaved man. He recounted every cruelty catalogued in the overseer's own journal, speaking each name and each punishment with the precision of a court clerk reading charges before sentencing. He described Marcus's beating in the carriage house, the welts that had turned to scars, the permanent flinch that now defined the man's movements. He listed the families separated and sold, the children torn from mothers, the calculated starvations and degradations that Crenshaw had documented with such clinical pride. And finally, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper but somehow more terrible for its quietness, Elijah described what had happened to Sarah in that office, how he had been forced to stand guard while his sister was violated, how something essential had been extracted from her that could never be restored. Crenshaw's response evolved through predictable stages as the laudanum continued to cloud his thinking and the reality of his situation penetrated his understanding. First came outrage, the affronted dignity of a man whose authority had been challenged, threats of punishment so severe they defied description. Then came attempts at negotiation, promises of better treatment, offers of money and eventual freedom if Elijah would only release him now before this madness progressed further. Then came appeals to religion, invocations of Christian mercy and divine judgment, suggestions that violence would only damn Elijah's soul to eternal torment. And finally, as Elijah picked up the skinning knife and tested its edge against his thumb, came the fear, raw and undisguised, the primal terror of prey recognizing that the predator cannot be reasoned with or escaped. Elijah approached Crenshaw's outstretched right hand, the hand that had held the whip, the hand that had signed bills of sale, the hand that had touched Sarah. He positioned the knife blade against the base of Crenshaw's index finger where skin met nail, and he began with the smallest possible cut, a shallow scoring that barely broke the surface but which announced his intention with absolute clarity. Crenshaw jerked against his bonds, the movement instinctive and useless, and made a sound that was not quite a scream but rather a sharp exhalation of shock and disbelief that this was truly happening. The technique Elijah employed was derived from his observations of animal butchering combined with the anatomical knowledge gleaned from the stolen medical text. He worked from extremities inward, beginning with the fingers where nerve endings were concentrated and pain would be exquisite but blood loss minimal. The blade scored around each finger in careful circles, separating skin from the underlying tissue with the practiced motion of someone who had visualized this process countless times. The skin of the fingers came away in strips, revealing the pale fascia beneath, and Crenshaw's screams began in earnest, echoing off the stone walls in waves that would have summoned help anywhere else but which served only to accentuate his absolute isolation. Elijah worked in silence, his face showing no emotion, his hands steady as a surgeon's. He paused periodically to ensure Crenshaw remained conscious, using techniques he had learned from observing Dr. Whitmore's treatment of shock, applying pressure to specific points, speaking in a calm voice to keep the overseer anchored to awareness. Unconsciousness would be an escape was not permitted. Crenshaw would experience every moment of what was being done to him, would understand completely the reversal of power that was occurring in this forgotten ice house. The progression from fingers to hand to forearm took perhaps an hour, though time in that space seemed to operate by different rules, stretching and contracting with each scream and each careful incision. Elijah removed the skin from Crenshaw's right arm in sections, working with the deliberation of someone who had all the time in the world and intended to use it thoroughly. The exposed muscles gleamed wetly in the lamplight, red and glistening, still twitching with involuntary contractions as nerves fired in confusion. Blood ran down the butcher's table and dripped onto the packed earth floor, forming a dark pool that reflected the lamplight like an obscene mirror. Crenshaw's mind began to fracture under the sustained agony, his pleas becoming incoherent, his prayers fragmenting into meaningless syllables. He begged for death with the desperate sincerity of someone who had finally understood that oblivion would be a mercy, but mercy was precisely what Elijah had come to this place to deny him. The overseer who had dealt in suffering as casually as other men dealt in cotton or tobacco now discovered that suffering had depths he had never imagined, that the human capacity to experience pain far exceeded the human capacity to inflict it under normal circumstances, and that these were not normal circumstances. The left arm followed the same pattern as the right, Elijah working with unwavering focus despite the accumulating horror of what he was creating. Crenshaw's screams had subsided into continuous moaning punctuated by animal whimpers, his body's attempt to conserve energy in the face of trauma that should have killed him but somehow had not. The laudanum that had made him docile and manageable was now perhaps the only thing keeping shock from granting him the release of unconsciousness, the drug's effects creating a cruel equilibrium where awareness persisted despite agony that should have overwhelmed all cognitive function. When Elijah moved to Crenshaw's chest, beginning the careful scoring around the collarbone, the overseer's eyes rolled back and his body convulsed against the restraints with enough force to make the chair creak. Elijah paused, waiting for the convulsion to pass, then applied cold water from a bucket he had prepared, the shock of it pulling Crenshaw back to full awareness. The chest was larger territory, requiring more time and presenting greater risk of fatal blood loss if major vessels were severed. Elijah worked with surgical precision, his blade finding the planes between skin and muscle, separating layers with the knowledge of someone who understood exactly what he was doing and why. The horror of the scene was not merely in the physical act but in the intimacy it required. Elijah had to lean close to Crenshaw, had to smell his fierce sweat and the copper tang of his blood, had to hear every ragged breath and broken whimper. This proximity forced a terrible connection between them, an intimacy more profound than any consensual touch because it was built on complete domination and absolute helplessness. Crenshaw was being unmade, layer by layer, his body literally opened and exposed in a violation that exceeded any physical assault because it penetrated to the most fundamental level of bodily integrity. As the chest skin came away in a large section, revealing the pale geometry of ribs beneath red muscle, Crenshaw's consciousness began its final retreat from reality. His eyes remained open but the awareness behind them had fled to some interior space where the pain could not follow. He no longer screamed or begged, only made soft sounds like a wounded animal might make, sounds without language or meaning, pure expression of suffering without the framework of human consciousness to contain it. This regression represented the complete breaking that Crenshaw had inflicted on so many others, that dissolution of personhood under sustained cruelty that reduced human beings to purely physical existence. Elijah recognized this breaking and understood that his revenge had achieved its purpose. Crenshaw's death was now inevitable, shock and blood loss having progressed beyond any point where recovery was possible. The overseer's skin hung in tatters, great sections removed to expose the architecture beneath, his body transformed into something that barely resembled human form. His breathing had become shallow and irregular, the stuttering rhythm of a body shutting down system by system. His face had gone the color of old parchment, lips blue, eyes glazed and unseeing. The final moments came as dawn began to gray the darkness outside, pale light seeping through the gaps around the icehouse door. Crenshaw's breathing stopped without ceremony or drama, simply ceased between one breath and the next, life departing with the quiet inevitability of a candle burning down to nothing. Elijah stood over the body for several minutes, the knife still in his hand, his clothes soaked with blood that was already beginning to darken and stiffen. He felt nothing in that moment, no satisfaction or remorse, no triumph or horror, only a vast emptiness where his humanity had been. He cleaned the knife carefully and methodically, using water from the bucket and a cloth he had brought for this purpose. He extinguished the oil lamps and gathered his tools, working with the same methodical precision that had characterized the entire night. The body would need to be disposed of, the scene cleaned, the evidence scattered to the four winds so that Bartholomew Crenshaw's disappearance would remain an unsolved mystery. But before any of that practical work, Elijah sat on the stone steps of the icehouse and watched the sun rise over Blackridge Plantation, the light touching the frost-covered fields and beginning the slow work of melting what the night had frozen. Something had ended in that icehouse, but it was not merely Crenshaw's life. Some part of Elijah had died there too, some possibility of return to innocence or redemption, some final connection to the man he had been before Sarah's assault and Marcus's screams and 3 years of accumulated degradation had transformed him into an instrument of vengeance. He had become the monster that monsters create when they push human beings beyond the breaking point, and there was no path back from that transformation. He rose finally, his body aching with fatigue, and set about the practical work of disappearing a body and cleaning a crime scene. The sun continued its rise, indifferent to human suffering and human revenge alike, marking the beginning of just another day at Blackridge Plantation, where nothing had changed and everything had changed, where an overseer had vanished and a valet had been transformed into something that could no longer properly be called human. The disposal of Bartholomew Crenshaw's body was accomplished with the same methodical precision that had characterized every aspect of Elijah's revenge. He wrapped the corpse in canvas he had stored in the icehouse, loaded it onto a handcart normally used for moving feed sacks, and transported it in the pre-dawn darkness to the hog enclosure at the far western edge of Blackridge property. The plantation's hogs were large, half-wild creatures that had been allowed to forage freely and had developed an omnivorous appetite that made them ideal for Elijah's purpose. He deposited the body in their pen and watched as the animals, attracted by the scent of blood, approached cautiously at first and then with growing enthusiasm. Within 6 hours, there would be nothing left but scattered bones that could belong to any animal carcass, evidence so thoroughly destroyed that reconstruction would be impossible. The ice house required more careful attention. Elijah spent the remainder of the morning scrubbing blood from the stone walls and packed earth floor, using harsh lye soap and multiple buckets of water carried from the creek. He burned the ropes and leather straps in the small fire he built to heat the water, watching them curl and blacken and disappear into ash. The butcher's table he dismantled and scattered across the plantation, a plank here and a leg there, pieces of anonymous lumber that would draw no particular notice. The wooden chair he returned to the trash pile from which he had originally retrieved it, positioning it so it appeared never to have been moved. His blood-soaked clothes he burned completely, standing naked in the cold morning air while the fabric turned to ash, then dressing in clean garments he had hidden nearby. By the time he returned to the main house at mid-morning, ostensibly from gathering firewood, Elijah had transformed back into the unremarkable valet who had existed before the previous night. His face showed the same blank attentiveness, his movements the same practiced efficiency, his demeanor utterly unchanged. When Assistant Overseer Hayes asked if he had seen Crenshaw that morning, Elijah responded with appropriate deference that he had not, that the overseer had dismissed him early the previous evening and he had assumed Crenshaw was sleeping late after his Thursday evening drinking. This was the first inquiry, but it would not be the last. Crenshaw's absence became noticeable by noon, when he failed to appear for the midday inspection of field work that was part of his invariable routine. Hayes and Donovan searched his office and quarters, finding nothing disturbed, no signs of struggle or hasty departure. His horse remained in the stable, his personal belongings undisturbed, his ledgers and papers exactly where he always kept them. It was as if he had simply vanished between Thursday evening and Friday morning, stepping out of existence without trace or explanation. The assistant overseers organized a search party, enslaved men walking the property in lines, checking every building and field and tree line, finding nothing. A courier was dispatched to Richmond to inform Silas Blackridge of his overseer's disappearance, and the plantation owner returned 3 days later, annoyed rather than concerned. Blackridge's primary emotion seemed to be irritation at the inconvenience, the disruption to his schedule and the administrative burden of finding a replacement. He authorized a more extensive search, brought in men with tracking dogs who followed scent trails that led nowhere conclusive, and ultimately concluded that Crenshaw had either been murdered by unknown assailants or had absconded for reasons equally unknown. Neither possibility particularly troubled Silas, who within a week had hired a new overseer, a man named Garrett from North Carolina with similar credentials and similar philosophy regarding the management of enslaved labor. Life at Blackridge continued with barely a ripple to mark Crenshaw's disappearance. The field hands worked, the tobacco grew, the cotton was planted, the brutal machinery of plantation economics ground forward with mechanical inevitability. But among the enslaved population, something had shifted, a subtle change in atmosphere that was difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. They looked at Elijah differently now, though they could not have explained why. There was a wariness in their regard, an unconscious deference, as if some animal instinct recognized that he had become dangerous in ways that transcended the normal dangers of plantation life. Elijah himself existed in a state of profound disconnection from normal human emotion. He felt no guilt for what he had done, no remorse that might have suggested retained connection to conventional morality. But he also felt no satisfaction, no sense of justice achieved or balance restored. The revenge had been necessary in the way that breathing was necessary, an act of survival rather than choice, but its completion had left him hollowed out, emptied of something essential that could not be recovered or replaced. He performed his duties for the new overseer Garrett with the same mechanical efficiency he had shown Crenshaw, but he was no longer fully present in his own life, existing at one remove from reality like a ghost haunting the ruins of his former self. Sarah never recovered from what Crenshaw had done to her. She continued working in the main house kitchen, her hands performing familiar tasks while her spirit remained elsewhere, trapped in that office on that February morning when something irreplaceable had been stolen from her. She barely spoke anymore, even to Elijah, and when she did her voice carried a flatness that suggested all emotional color had been leached from her experience. She died 6 years later in 1859, officially of a fever but really of a spiritual wound that had never healed, her body finally giving up on life that her spirit had already abandoned. Elijah buried her in the slave cemetery at the edge of Blackridge property and felt the final thread connecting him to his former humanity snap cleanly in two. The whispers began perhaps 6 months after Crenshaw's disappearance, stories that spread among enslaved people with the speed and stealth of wildfire through dry grass. Some claimed to have heard screams coming from the old ice house on cold nights, sounds that carried impossible distances and seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Others reported seeing lights in that abandoned structure, flickering through the gaps around its door when by all rights it should have been dark and empty. Travelers on the road that passed near Blackridge's eastern boundary told of hearing a man begging for mercy in a voice that seemed to come from underground, pleas that ended in screams that chilled the blood. These stories acquired the quality of legend, embellished and elaborated with each retelling, until Crenshaw's disappearance became part of the folklore of that region of Virginia. The supernatural explanations served multiple purposes for those who told them. They provided a framework for processing an event that otherwise had no explanation, a mystery that troubled the orderly universe of cause and effect. They also served as a form of justice inaccessible through legal or institutional channels, the suggestion that Crenshaw had received divine punishment for his earthly crimes even if earthly law would never have held him accountable. Elijah survived to see the end of the war in 1865, witnessed Union troops marching through Virginia, and heard the words that proclaimed him legally free after 32 years of bondage. The emancipation that others greeted with tears and prayers left him unmoved, freedom feeling abstract and meaningless to someone who had already severed all the internal connections that made freedom valuable. He remained at Blackridge for another year, working now for wages that were barely better than his previous existence, then drifted north to Philadelphia where a community of formerly enslaved people had established itself. In Philadelphia, Elijah found work as a porter and then as a clerk, his literacy making him valuable in ways it never could have been in Virginia. He lived quietly and alone, maintaining no close relationships, speaking to no one about his past. He never married, never formed attachments that might have anchored him back to the human community, existing in a self-imposed isolation that was both protection and prison. The years accumulated around him like sediment, burying the past beneath layers of present moments that he experienced without fully inhabiting. He died in the winter of 1891 at the age of 70, alone in a rented room, his body discovered 3 days later by a landlord concerned about unpaid rent. There were no personal effects of significance, no letters or photographs or mementos that might have suggested a life fully lived. The city buried him in a potter's field, an unmarked grave among thousands of other anonymous dead, and the world that had extracted so much from him took no particular notice of his departure. But at Blackridge Plantation, which by 1891 had changed hands twice and fallen into partial ruin, the stories persisted and even strengthened with the passage of time. The ice house remained standing, its stone walls too solid to easily demolish and its location too remote to bother with, and it acquired a reputation as a haunted place that locals avoided after dark. The legends evolved, incorporating new details with each generation, until the truth of what had happened there in March of 1853 became indistinguishable from the myths that had grown up around it. The question that haunted that place, and that haunts this story, is whether what Elijah did in that ice house was justice or the birth of a monster. Was his revenge a righteous response to systematic brutality, or did it transform him into the very thing he had sought to destroy? The system of slavery that created Crenshaw's cruelty bore responsibility for the cruelty it spawned in response, the violence it generated in those it oppressed. Elijah's act was not isolated but part of a larger pattern of cause and effect, the inevitable consequence of a society built on the principle that some human beings could be treated as property and that their suffering carried no moral weight. The ice house still stands today, though Blackridge Plantation itself is long gone, the land divided and developed beyond recognition. Local historians know the stories but dispute their veracity, finding no documentary evidence of Crenshaw's disappearance and suggesting the entire tale is apocryphal, folklore rather than history. But people who live near that old structure still report hearing sounds on cold March nights, screams that seem to come from beneath the earth, and whether these sounds are acoustic anomalies or the echoes of genuine horror depends on what you choose to believe about the capacity of place to remember atrocity. What is certain is that Elijah Morse existed, that he lived and suffered and ultimately acted, and that his action carried consequences that extended far beyond the death of one overseer. He became a ghost himself long before his actual death, haunting his own life, unable to reclaim the humanity that Blackridge Plantation had systematically destroyed and that his revenge had finally annihilated. His story is a testament to what human beings become when they are pushed beyond all reasonable breaking points, when the only dignity available is the terrible dignity of vengeance, when justice through legitimate channels is so thoroughly denied that it must be seized through horrific means. The moral reckoning this story demands is uncomfortable because it refuses easy answers. We can condemn what Elijah did while understanding why he did it. We can recognize his transformation into a monster while acknowledging the larger monstrosity that created him. We can feel horror at the skinning of Bartholomew Crenshaw while feeling equal horror at the system that made Crenshaw possible and that would have continued untouched if not for individual acts of resistance, however terrible those acts might have been. On cold March nights, if you stand near that old ice house 20 miles south of Richmond, you might hear what sounds like screaming carried on the wind. And whether those screams belong to Crenshaw receiving his punishment or to Elijah mourning his lost humanity or to the countless enslaved people whose suffering was never avenged and whose names were never recorded, that is a question that history cannot answer and that haunts that place still, a moral ambiguity that refuses resolution and demands that we sit with its discomfort rather than retreat into comfortable certainties about justice and revenge and the terrible prices both exact from human souls. If this dark chapter of history disturbed you as much as it did me, subscribe for more macabre true stories and tell me in the comments what historical horror I should uncover next.